It was a day like any other. I was at my husband's house, which is where we've lived since we got married. On that specific day, my husband needed to leave for a few hours to resolve work matters, something related to an urgent meeting that could not be postponed. He left hurriedly after breakfast, leaving me alone at home. I took advantage of that moment of solitude to take care of myself a little, something that becomes a rare luxury in a busy everyday life. The house was enveloped in a peaceful silence, interrupted only by the soft sounds of nature coming through the half-open kitchen window. Birds sang and a gentle breeze made the curtains dance lightly. Everything pointed to a peaceful and solitary day, exactly what I needed after a week full of commitments and household chores, shared with my father-in-law, who, as he lived with us, was almost always present. So I decided to take a relaxing bath, something to rejuvenate my body and mind. I filled the tub, adjusted the water temperature to warm but pleasant, and added a few drops of lavender essential oil for an even more calming experience. The hot steam filled the bathroom, creating an almost spa-like environment, enveloping me in a cloud of heat and aroma that promised to melt away any residual tension. I submerged myself in the water, closing my eyes as my muscles gradually relaxed. In that moment of pure serenity, I was far from everything, immersed in my own watery world. My father-in-law, who had supposedly left early for an Army veterans gathering, was not in my thoughts, and the house felt just mine, free and peaceful. However, the peace was abruptly interrupted when I heard the sound of the bathroom door opening. My heart raced, eyes still closed, unable to understand what was happening. Maybe he forgot something, I thought, trying to convince myself that there was no cause for alarm. But inside, an uncomfortable feeling began to form, an uneasiness that would soon take on a much clearer form. As the hot water gently fell over my body, the sound of the shower filled the room with a steady, calming noise. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible click cut through the hum of the water. My eyes widened, and the quiet haze of heat was replaced by a rush of alertness. The bathroom door slowly opened, and through the fog glass of the shower stall, I could see the silhouette of a man. At first, my heart skipped a beat, thinking that perhaps my husband had returned early from his appointments. Maybe he had forgotten something, or maybe he wanted to surprise me. For a brief moment, a spark of joy crossed my mind, but then, as the figure became clearer and the door opened completely, I realized it wasn't my husband. The heart, once bouncing, now beat with a heavy, rapid force. He was my father-in-law. He stopped, looking as surprised as I was, and his first words were a hurried mumble. "I thought the house was empty," he said, his shaky voice mixing with the sound of water. He should have knocked, should have announced his presence somehow, but he didn't. That simple omission caused a wave of discomfort to wash over me. I instinctively covered myself with my hands, even though I knew that the fog glass of the shower offered little protection against the invasive gaze. I'm gonna leave now," he stammered, seeming to finally understand the gravity of the moment. The door closed behind him, and I was left there, alone again, but the feeling of relaxation had completely evaporated. The bath, which should be a refuge, became a scene of vulnerability and tension. The once caressing water now seemed to hit with a different weight, and each drop was a reminder of the abrupt, uncomfortable invasion. The rest of my shower was quick and anxious. Every little noise made me flinch, fearing the door would open again. When I finally turned off the shower, I wrapped the towel around myself with feverish quickness, wanting more than anything to be out of that space that, in a moment, had transformed from a sanctuary into a place of insecurity. On impulse, I quickly covered myself with whatever I could, grabbing the nearest towel with shaking hands. The water was still dripping down my body, mixing with the beginnings of tears of frustration and fear that were bubbling in my eyes. My father-in-law, realizing the gravity of the moment, immediately began to apologize. His words came out in a jumble, accompanied by nervous gestures, typical of someone caught red-handed in an embarrassing situation. "I really thought no one was home," he stuttered, hands raised in surrender. "It was a misunderstanding. I would never have." He tried to explain, but each word only added more weight to the discomfort that filled the air. The physical proximity, although now with a clear distance imposed by the shower glass and the context of the entire situation, made his intentions seem, at the very least, questionable. Despite the fear and surprise, a wave of firm determination hit me. "You need to leave," I said in a voice I barely recognized. Firmer than I expected, given the vulnerability of the moment. "Now," I added, when he hesitated, still muttering apologies. He stepped back, finally realizing the seriousness of his mistake, and with one last confused and embarrassed look, he left the bathroom, closing the door behind him. I stood there, still under the fragile protection of the towel, taking deep breaths to calm my racing heartbeat. The air felt colder now, every sound in the house magnified by the tense silence that followed my father-in-law's abrupt departure. I knew this wasn't just a simple mistake. The circumstances, the lack of prior communication about his return home, and the way it all happened left a trail of doubts and discomfort that I knew I would have to face sooner or later. After the incident, I was alone, locked in the bathroom, shaking and absolutely confused about what had happened. The steam from the shower had dissipated, but a fog of discomfort and disbelief still hung in the air, so thick it could almost be touched. The tears began to run down my face without me noticing, mixing with the last drops of water from the interrupted bath. My body was covered by the towel, but I felt a cold coming from inside, a cold that no layer of fabric could warm. Anger bubbled inside me like a pressure cooker. How could he? I asked myself repeatedly, as the feeling of betrayal intertwined with anger, forming a tight knot in my chest. But beyond the anger and betrayal, there was a palpable fear about how this revelation might affect my relationship with my husband. He and his father were close, a relationship of mutual respect and admiration. How would that change now? Wrapped up in these turbulent thoughts, I spent hours in my room, staring into space, trying to make sense of the emotional chaos. With each passing minute, the need to tell my husband everything became clearer. Trust and respect, pillars of our marriage, were at stake. I knew that hiding or minimizing the incident would only erode those foundations, even if the truth could deeply shake our relationship. Determined, but still apprehensive, I prepared myself for the conversation. I rehearsed the words in my mind, each sentence, each pause, anticipating reactions, preparing for the worst, hoping for the best. When I finally heard the sound of the keys in the door, signaling my husband's return, my heart sank. It was the moment. Receiving him with a hug that hid my nervousness, I took him to the living room, where, with a trembling but firm voice, I began to narrate every detail of what happened, without omitting anything. The words flowed now with an urgency I couldn't contain, and as I spoke, I watched every change in his expression, every tension in his posture. The conversation was intense and emotional. My husband listened attentively, with a seriousness he rarely showed. between surprise and disbelief, he didn't interrupt, letting me say everything. When I finished, there was a heavy silence filled with emotion and unspoken decisions that hung in the air like a storm about to break out. When my husband arrived, the atmosphere was filled with almost palpable tension. I led him to our small garden at the back of the house, a place we always considered our refuge, where conversations flowed more freely. He could see from my face that something serious had happened, and his expression was a mix of concern and confusion. As soon as we sat down, I began to relate everything that happened, without sparing any details, despite the difficulty in bringing up such an uncomfortable memory. He listened to me with an attention that wavered between disbelief and anguish, his eyes never leaving mine. Every word he said seemed to weigh on us, shading our space of peace a little more. When I finished, he remained silent for a long moment, processing the gravity of the situation. Visibly shaken, he ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration and concern. The disturbance in his gaze was evident, and he shook his head slowly, as if trying to deny the reality of the words he had just heard. After the initial impact, we began a long conversation about the implications of what had happened. We discussed the need to establish clearer boundaries with my father-in-law. The trust we had placed in him was now shaken, and living under the same roof was increasingly unsustainable. We talked about the possibility of reevaluating our living situation, perhaps looking for a new place, just for the two of us, where we could rebuild the security and privacy that our home was supposed to provide. My husband, despite his shock, completely supported my decision to be honest about the incident. He understood that by sharing what happened, I was not only seeking support, but also strengthening transparency between us. "We're in this together," he said firmly, holding my hand. "Let's face this together and make sure something like this never happens again." That support was a small ray of light amidst the turbulence. We decided that the next day we would have a serious talk with my father-in-law, clearly establishing the new limits and discussing future changes. The determination in his tone gave me strength, and I felt a mixture of relief and renewed trust in our bond. Together, we would face the consequences of this uncomfortable incident, working to make harmony and respect the basis of our home again.